Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. And once again, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first stab at doing a Zoom genealogy group meeting, where I'm hopeful this will work out. Tina's always got great content, we know, so we'll see. We'll see how this works. As far as any other announcements go, if you are thinking about working at the Highland Games and haven't contacted me yet, please do, because we could use a couple more people, especially on Friday. And I'm going to cross fingers and toes that we're able to meet in person in July, but I'll let everybody know as time goes on. And I think that's it. Tina, the floor is yours.
Or right, everybody, now that I've already gone, now that I've already gone through all of my technical difficulties, now I can share my screen so you guys can see what I'm talking about. All right, does everybody see that?
Yes.
Hopefully. Okay, so I am Tina Beaird. I know many of you. I am the owner of Tamarack Genealogy. I am the genealogy and local history librarian at the Plainfield Public Library. I have been there for what will be 20 years in September. So I started very, very young. I mean, I was just a toddler when they hired me. And I have been doing Scottish research on a settlement called Tamarack for 15 years. So I apologize if I talk super fast today, but they're actually dedicating a park to the Tamarack settlement today at noon. So I need to be out the door and on my way to Plainfield by 11:20. So exciting stuff. And I had no control over the date or the time. The park district was responsible for that. So I apologize if I'm going to go 1,000 miles an hour, but what we're going to talk about today is online Scottish resources. So I've been researching Scotland for 15 years. I've been over there several times to do research at various archives, libraries, museums, personal homes, churches. And the beauty with Scottish resources is that they've been putting resources online long before the pandemic struck. So luckily for us, they already had a really nice platform for making records available digitally long before everybody else was scrambling in 2020 to make that happen. So I'm going to throw a lot of things at you today. We're going to cover a set. I'm really not going to talk about wills and probates, but I definitely want to point out where you can find those. We're going to talk about things like vital records, wills and probates. Where would you find those? Tax records, criminal records, and immigration records always seem to be people's favorite topics. We'll talk about where to find military records. Maps are vital to us being able to do our Scottish research because people didn't go by the name of their community and they didn't go by the name of their county. They went by the farm name. So how do we identify the farms and where do we find them? I'm going to show you some map resources. And then at the very end, I'm going to talk about some extra things that I didn't get to talk about during the presentation. And then social media. Take full advantage of social media. I'm going to give you some great sites that are available on Flickr and Facebook and places like that. So in order for you to see my full screen, I'm going to turn my camera off. I'm also going to turn my camera off so that I don't glitch and I don't break anything because I have a tendency to do that. But I will turn my camera back on at the end.
So who forgot pants? You?
I talk with my hands a lot. You definitely don't want to be watching me talk with my hands. Okay. You guys know that that's what I do to begin with. See, and I've frozen already. Here we go. There we go. So now how do we get started? What if we don't know where our family is from? What if we don't have specifics about the community or the farm or the county where they lived? If you're like me and you have Scottish ancestors and you have a name like Campbell, you know, they're pretty much regionally located in the South. But then there are some names like Smith, even Highland names like MacDonald that you'll find all across the entire country of Scotland. So how do we narrow it down? Where are we going to look for these types of things? So here are some great resources that you can use. And I'm going to show you a couple of screenshots of a couple of them to kind of give you a feel for the type of information that they have. But there's Scotlands, which is a good site. Wikipedia, believe it or not, has a lot of place names and surnames and things like that. So for example, a lot of people when they came from Scotland, when they came to the US, named their communities after the communities they left at home. So if you have family who is living in Air, Nebraska, and they've been there for 5 generations, odds are they probably came from Ayrshire, or place like, or like Elgin, Illinois, which would be people from Elgin, Scotland. So sometimes taking advantage of US place names can help you as well. The Scotsman newspaper out of Glasgow has a surname map. You kind of see it in the bottom corner here to kind of give you some of the most common or the highest frequency that you'll see for some of these family names. Rampant Scotland has a great set of resources as well if you haven't used them. And then believe it or not, John Grenham, and you're going to look at me and say, well, that makes no sense. That's Ireland. But how many of us are Scots-Irish? And using John Grenham can kind of give us a heat map, not only a heat map of those Scots-Irish ancestors who came to Ireland before they came to the States, but it also gives me alternate spellings. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. So for example, one of my surnames is Cairns. In the US, it's kind of written like Karins, Karins. That's definitely a bastardization of the original spelling. But a couple different sites here that you can see. Scott Clans gives me some examples. It tells me what the crest is. It gives me a geolocation. It gives me some potential photos. It gives me a little bit about any potential tartan or clan history that's available. Another really good one that you probably have never used before is there's a site out there that's called familyeducation.com. And they have a site that allows you to look at Scottish surnames and also baby names and things like that, place names. It's a really good resource for that. I'm just getting started. I have absolutely no idea where to look. But this is one of those to kind of show you how do you spell that name? What is the meaning behind that name? What is the most, common prevalent location for that name? So it's a really good resource, and it's in your handout. I forwarded the handout to Bess because for whatever reason, it wouldn't let me upload it into the chat. It was giving me nothing but trouble. But every website that I mentioned today is going to be in that handout as soon as she has the opportunity to either upload that or pass that along to you. I mentioned John Grenham. Here's an example of that. Here's Karen's again. And you see kind of all of the different spellings of that name. So the traditional Karen's Scottish version, Karen's how my family spelled it in the US. And then it kind of gives me that heat map. So it tells me that there's a lot of them in and around Belfast. It tells me that there's a lot of them in Down. And then it kind of shows me that there are some families in other locations like Meath and Mayo and Wicklow. Now my family is from Cavan and Westmeath, but I don't know where my Karens are from. They could be from Cavan, but they might be from one of these other locations as well. So sometimes using John Grenham is a good start for that first step. Figure out where they are in Ireland, get those records. And sometimes those Irish records will tell you where they came from in Scotland before you have to make the leap back to Scotland and just try to, figure out. So I do a lot of research for the Craig family. So Craig is everywhere. So trying to narrow it down sometimes can be challenging because John has James, who has John, who has James. But sometimes using these tools can help me narrow down my research to kind of focus on one area at a time. So what do you do when you've got an extremely common name? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Scottish naming conventions. What I love most about the Scots is the fact that we're stubborn. I mean, truly stubborn. So we'll stick with something for a long, 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 long time. So whereas some other nationalities might have dropped their naming conventions by the second or third generation once they've left the country or come to the States or Canada or wherever, Scots stuck with it for a long time, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 generations. And it is really very rigid. So things like firstborn son is named after dad's dad. Firstborn daughter is named after mom's mom. Okay, then secondborn daughter is named after dad's mom. Third, or secondborn son is named after mom's dad. And there's a very set order to how this is done. And that's also why you'll see if a child dies that they'll reuse the same name until it sticks, so to speak, until a child lives. So you might see William used twice. You might see Janet used twice. So take a look at your ancestry. And like I said, you'll have John who has James, who has John, who has James. They're following that Scottish naming convention. So if you can figure out based on I don't know who mom and dad to Andrew Craig are, but I know that his first 4 children are named James, Mary, Martha, and John, or Matthew, I should say. Then I can look at that order and say, okay, so this means that Andrew's parents are named Mary and Matthew, and that mom's parents are most likely named, James and Martha. And that helps you narrow down. And it's typically true. It's not always true, but it's typically true. So sometimes that's what you need to be able to get back that next generation. So then I can go into websites, and I'll show you some examples where I can put in Andrew Craig, for example, and then look for parents specifically with those 2 names and see what comes up. So Scottish naming conventions are really, really important to your research. But something to keep in mind too is it's so rigid that it's not until you get down to the 8th, 9th, 10th child that you finally get to pick one for yourself. So when you get to those kids and their names are Alexander and Lafayette, and they're really more unusual names, sometimes that becomes that key to unlocking that location. Because if you're looking for John and James and John and James, but then, you have, an Alexander, start searching for that more unusual name to help you work yourself backwards. But then a lot of times, and you'll see it in the States as well as you'll see it in Scotland, where they're going to go by their nicknames or their diminutives. So in Scotland, they might have been Ian. Here they change it to John. But then some of those more unlikely ones that you might not have ever thought of before would be things like Morag for Sarah, Grizel for Grace. Alistair's kind of easy to figure out. But then things like, I'm trying to think of a good example, Jessie for Janet or Jane, right? That might be a little bit more unusual, but that's a nickname. That's a diminutive. That's not necessarily their birth name. So sometimes you have to be a little creative in how you do your searching. But then sometimes you have to be open-minded and not discount names either. They don't fit neatly into the family tree just yet, but I'm setting them aside because maybe this Jessie is related in some way. And then it comes to find out that, oh, okay, Jessie is really Janet, and I already have Janet in my tree. So now I can bring those records together. So I know my talk says no Scotland's people, that there's more than Scotland's people, but there's a couple of things I have to highlight in Scotland's people because there are different ways to use Scotland's people to get more out of it than just here's my money and I'm going to do my searches and download my records. So there are other places where I can see indexes for the censuses, but this is really the best place for original images of the indexes. Yes, they're available through Scottish indexes. Yes, they're available through Family Search, but they're not tied together. So for example, if I go into Family Search and I search the 1851 Scottish index and I search for Andrew Craig, it'll show me all the Andrew Craigs, but it doesn't tell me who else is in the household. It's not indexed down to that level. So this is one of those times where I have to pay the money to have access to it. Same things with wills and testaments. I'm not going to find as deep of a resource as I can here. Same things with valuations. The downside with valuations on Scotland's people is they only did the 5s in 1860, 1865, 1870. They didn't do all of the years in between. Those are available at the National Records Office in Scotland, in Edinburgh, but they're not available online just yet. So this is kind of a place where I can go to look for that. But the way Scotland's people has their records broken down is they're broken down into categories. So when you're searching, you have to choose. Am I searching the old parochial registers, which I'll describe in a minute? Am I searching Catholic records? Am I searching state statutory records? So when you go to the site, you have to kind of choose what it is you're going to look for. So here's kind of a screenshot of what the homepage looks like. If I want to look for birth, marriages, or deaths, I'm going to click on church registers if it's before 1855, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. That was the only option you had. There were no state-sponsored governmental records in Scotland before 1855, so you have to rely on church records for that information. After 1855, they stopped collecting them on the church level and started collecting them by the counties within the state of Scotland. So if I click on those church records, what's it going to tell me? So I want to search for Finlay, but it's not searching Finlay across all of their church records. You have to choose, which is kind of frustrating. So you have to know Are they established church, meaning mainstream Presbyterian? Or could they have belonged to one of the quote unquote other churches? So most of my people, so if you have family that comes from Ayrshire, if you have people who come from the borderlands, at one time, 60% of people in Ayrshire, Scotland, belonged to sects or divisions other than the established Presbyterian church. It was either relief church, most of it was free church. Sometimes you'd have burghers or anti-burghers, but they weren't established. So when you look at Church of Scotland, that's the established church. So if I'm looking for my Craigs, my Campbells, I'm looking for my Folds or Burns or any of those others, I'm going to look under other churches. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that Scotland's people made those available. You had to go to the National Archives in Scotland to find them. But they do have some now. They're not complete. It's not all of those different sects to the Presbyterian Church, but it's certainly a start. So you want to make sure you're checking. If it comes up empty under Church of Scotland, you want to look under other churches. And another important thing about that also is that the Church of Scotland was responsible for all deaths in Scotland, whether you were established church or not. If you were Latter-day Saints, if you were Roman Catholic, if you were Jewish, if you were Methodist, they were responsible for all deaths, all burials within Scotland up until after 1855. It wasn't until cemeteries in the late 19th century got started when you had a little bit of choice. So you'll most likely find all of your ancestors listed in the Church of Scotland records for deaths. But if you're looking for births and marriages, then those are the things that are going to typically show up under those other churches. So I did a search under Finlay. I was specifically looking in Loudon because that's where they were at the time. And it brings up a series of records for me. But I'm cheap. I think most of us Scots are, no offense to anybody else, at least my family is. So I don't want to pay 6 credits every time I want to download a record. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this in tandem with other sites. And predominantly, I'm going to use it in tandem with Family Search. So I can create an account in Scotland's People. I can do my search. I can look at the index. I don't have to buy credits to look at the index. So I can go in and I can look for all of the Finlays that are listed in Loudon. And look at what it tells me. The top record, James Finlay, parents, Andrew Finlay and Jean Walker. No, that's not my person. But George Finlay, parents, Thomas Finlay and Agnes Mitchell might be. And it gives me everything I need to look in another source. It tells me, the date that the child was born. It tells me the parish number. This corresponds with the National Register, the church records at the archives. But it gives me the date, it gives me the name, and it gives me the parish. So then I can go into some place like Family Search. If you're at an affiliate library, you have access to the digital reels for Scotland. I have yet to come across one that's not digitized and available. But I can go in and I can do a search on Ayrshire and Loudon, and I can look directly at those records if I'm at an affiliate library. In most public libraries in the Chicagoland area, many, many, many of them are. So if you contact your local library, they could tell you if they are, and if they aren't, they can certainly tell you where the closest one is. In Plainfield, we are, Fountaindale is, Arlington Heights is, Wheaton is, there's a lot of us. But it shows me, okay, these are the records that we have on the left-hand side. These are the records we have for Loudon. We've got baptisms back to 1673. We've got deaths back to 1811. And then the little camera tells me that the digital images are there. So when I click on them, if I already know the date, I can go through the book chronologically and find that year, find that date in that record. And then I'm looking at the original digital image and I'm not paying credits to Scotland's People. No, that's kind of a way of, kind of cheating the system, but, it also saves me a lot of money. So here's an example of one of those pages. But what I want you to be aware of, if you're going to do it that way, if you're not going to use an every name index and you're going to go through the records image by image, keep in mind that sometimes family would register all of their kids at once. And there's a reason for this. I'll talk about this in just a second, but pay very close attention to terminology. So natural children mean that they are illegitimate. Typically, they're recognized by the father. The father takes responsibility for the child. But there's a difference when you're looking at these records between lawful, meaning husband and wife, and natural, So on this one page alone, you've got two naturals and a lawful. You've got a lawful up at the top. So it was not uncommon. It was, while it might have been frowned upon, it wasn't, they weren't mistreated. They weren't kicked out of the church. They just had to repent for their behavior. They had to go before the session once the woman started to show and say, yeah, I did it. And then they were usually allowed back into the church. But keep that terminology in mind when you're looking at records. Another thing to keep in mind too is that when the law changed in 1855, it became mandatory for all people to register the births of their children or pay a fine. So if you didn't pay by January of 1855, then you were charged £5 for every child that you failed to register. So sometimes you'll find a whole slew of kids registered right before the deadline because they didn't want to have to pay the £5 per kid to get them registered with the state. Here's an example. Right before the Finleys decided to come to America, they went into the local church and registered all of their children. So there was a record of them. So this record dates back to 1844 because you could see the child above is still an infant, but Stephen Finley, 1820, his brother William is 1824, Andrew is 1826. So these kids are being registered, 20 years after the fact so that they had a record of their birth so they could leave the country. So sometimes looking at the very end of the book, if you're going to go through it page by page, is where you're going to find those family groups. So like I said, they changed the law and they required them to have to pay a fine if they didn't register their kids on time. So here's another example of that. So they've got, the Black family came in and registered all their kids. The Folds came in and registered all their kids. The Thompsons came in. And this is the last 5 or 6 pages at the end of that church book, making sure that they're getting in right before the deadline. So you could see at the top of the page, 1855, but then look at the dates for these kids. 1837, 1850, 51, 39. I mean, they really waited till the last conceivable chance to do that. But language is important also. So like I said, deaths are going to show up under established church. Also check, because sometimes the free church or the relief church would record it as well. But language is important. So if you see something like relict, which you would see in this record here, tells me that Agnes Muir, who is the wife of James Craig, that she outlived him, that she survives and he's the one that's deceased. Okay. So I'm done with Scotland's people. I just wanted to give you some suggestions on how to get the most out of it. But Scotland's Places is one of my favorite places. It used to charge you quarterly and now it's free. And I can see all kinds of records. Now, the vast majority of the records that are in here date from the late 17th century to the mid 18th century, but it's still going to be useful to us in our research, even if we're not back to that point yet, because it's going to have things like tax rolls listed. It's going to have things like county and town records, the ordnance surveys, these maps that I'm talking about that I'll go into in more detail a little later on. These gazetteers and directories, these are all really, really important to our research because gazetteers and directories are like our modern county histories and city directories. So they're really useful in our research. You could search it by location. So here's a screenshot where I can go in and I can choose Argyll, I can choose Ayrshire, I can choose West Lothian. And it's going to show me a collection of the types of records they have. So I didn't give you that screenshot, but it would basically be a laundry list of these are the types of records we have for West Lothian. We have hearth records, poll tax records, land records, horse tax records, dog tax records. We've got ordinance books, we've got gazetteers, we've got directories, and it breaks it all down by location so that I can click on whichever one I'm interested in. Go through the original. They've scanned the original indexes. It's not just, or the original books. It's not just an abstract or an index anymore. You're looking at the original records. So this is an example. This is a land tax book. This one is from 1803. It's for the town of Draghorn, and it shows me all of the people who are paying tax on their land. So kind of like those valuation books, which are printed. This one is handwritten. So it tells me that William McCready is responsible for a series of farms as the vector. And then it tells me, for whom, what are the names of the farms? So remember what I was saying about how sometimes we don't know what farm it is, or we struggle to figure out, I have this name, but it's not a town name. I can't figure out why I can't find it because it's probably a farm name. So we have another one for Crawford, one of his farms is Middleton. That's my surname. So it definitely is something that's useful to you in your research. But land tax, poll tax, hearth tax, typically these are for people who have a little bit of money, where they own their property and they're paying for the luxury to have these goods. You're going to find your other family members listed in either the dog tax, the horse tax, the male and female servant taxes. So the wealthy people in town are the ones who are paying the tax on their servants, but the servants are listed in the records. So if my John Craig is a farm laborer, he's going to show up as the servant or the employee of somebody who's paying this tax. So a lot of people, who you're not going to find in traditional records because they didn't own anything, there's no will or probate because they didn't have anything worth taxing, will show up in these records as well. So fabulous resource. If you haven't played with Scotland's Places before, definitely go in and take a look at it. In your handout, you're going to see that there's a link to the National Records of Scotland. This is just a little more detail about how to understand taxation records and where are they located and how can I use them. So while Scotland's Places doesn't necessarily drill into how these records worked, you can get that through the National Records Office of Scotland. Here's an example of one of those ordnance surveys that you'll find in Scotland's Places. So my family was from Finnick, and it tells me a little bit about the parish. Again, those churches, established church, free church, all of those are going to be listed here. It's going to tell me a little bit about the community in the town. How big is it? A little bit of information about the school. It's going to give me its kind of geographic description. It's going to tell me about hills and valleys and wells and lakes and rivers, all of which kind of builds that understanding of why was your family there? But it's going to list important people in town too. So it's going to tell me, who the local schoolmaster is, who the postmaster is, who the minister is. All of that's going to be provided. And then it's going to show me the ordnance maps themselves. So here's an example of Finnick. This is a later one, but it shows me that there's the established church, which is the cross right in the middle, but then they've got two additional churches as well. They've got the United Presbyterian Church up in the top left corner. There's the Free Church. So this little tiny community had 3 separate parishes in it for a population of probably less than 1,000. But these ordnance surveys can provide that information for you. So it's showing me all of the structures in the buildings. All of these numbers are the different farmlands that are going to be represented in those ordnance books that you can then go and look up 941, 911, 914 to find out more information. Here's a more modern view of that same town. We can see that we still have the church listed and we still have the 2 free churches merged. They're now both United Free Churches instead of a UP church and a free church, but all 3 of them are still there. And you can see that those farms have changed very little in the 30 or 40 years since the previous survey. So I want to talk just briefly about criminal records. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there are some really good places to find some information. Believe it or not, Scots were extremely litigious, and they even were once they got here to the US. So not only do they show up as the person who's suing, but they'll show up as the person who's being charged as well. And there are so many layers to court records in the UK as well as in Scotland. So, you've got your criminal court, but then you've got the high court. So those are crimes against the state. So those are people like Jacobites and Covenanters. High Court, Sheriff's Court, Franchise Court, Justice of the Peace Court. So Justice of the Peace is I'm going to hear your petty disagreements before we move it up the food chain. So you have a fence line dispute or your neighbor's cattle eat your daisies. Those are the kinds of things that are going to show up in Justice of the Peace. Sheriff's Court, there's Debtor's Court. Those are the kind of things where you got caught for poaching rabbits on the Lord's land. So you're being brought up on charges. Criminal court is going to be things like rioting, looting, rape, murder, assault, those kind of things. So a lot of them are starting to show up online, not all of them, but some of them. So you'll find things like prisoners' records from 1840 to 1870 are online. They're available through the Home Health Department. That's on the next slide. Those are in Find My Past, but they're going to have things like age, height, weight, date and place of birth, marital status, aliases. You're going to find all kinds of things like that. This is a copy out of the debtor's book. And I wanted to include it just because the guy's name was Barnabas Collins, which I thought was just absolutely riotous. Like me and you liked watching Dark Shadows when you were a kid. Barnabas Collins shows up in the debtor's books because he owed a local businessman because he had run a line of credit and hadn't been able to pay. So you're going to find things like that, those kinds of things listed in there. So even though we think, oh, my family were upstanding citizens, they never got into trouble, sometimes it would be for the smallest of infractions. So if you were thrown in debtor's prison for being a debtor that couldn't pay their debt, they charged you $1 a day. Well, if you're already broke, how are you ever going to pay? How is your family ever going to pay you out of debtor's prison when they're charging you £1 a day? So some of these people, it was like a life sentence just simply because they were poor. So I mentioned some of those criminal records, those more severe criminal records. Those are those things where, you know, you raised arms against the state like the Covenanters or the Jacobites did, or, you know, you were arrested for and tried for larceny or other types of crimes. Those records are available through a number of places, and these will be in your handout. Scottish Indexes is a really good site. That's where you can see all the women who were arrested and charged for witchcraft. I'm not going to get on my soapbox about that. So any strong, independent, tough woman could be brought up on witchcraft charges if she, you know, spoke out of turn. Vast number of resources on this available through Scottish Indexes. Find My Past has crime and punishment records as well as those workhouse records. Like I said, if you were poor and thrown into a debtor's prison or a debtor's workhouse, those records are available. Not for the entire country of Scotland, but it's kind of hit or miss at the moment, but it's still a good resource, an avenue to start, and then always go back and double check. And then Ancestry UK has what are called prison Hulk records. So, you know, we're not talking about Marvel's Hulk. What they're talking about are those people who were arrested and who were going to be tried in that high court judiciary in the UK. They were going to be brought to London for their crimes, who were held on board ships until they could be transferred to London for trial. So this is where you're going to find those most egregious offenses against the crown, against the British government. So a lot of Covenanters will show up in these records. Like I said, Jacobites will show up in these records. You know, if somebody assaults a British officer and they get arrested, they'll show up in these Hulk records. Those are just the people who are being held on board ships until they could be transported. And a lot of times you'll find the people who are being transported to the colonies, who were being expelled from the UK, that were being sent to the US. And after the revolution, they couldn't send them here anymore. So they started sending them to Australia and to other places. You'll find those people listed in these records a lot of times also. Here's an example of one of those sheriff's court records. This is a small debt book. This one's from the National Archives in Edinburgh, but it kind of gives you just some very rough ideas of, you know, it's usually people who are in debt to business owners, and it's giving me the name of the business owner and what he is. He's a carter, he's a shoemaker, he's a carrier, those types of things. Here's another one that I got out of the National Archives in Scotland. This is the list of bounties. So the British government put out a price on the head of Covenanters, and if they were caught, how much would be paid out. So you could see that they were paying, you know, 10,000, 20,000, you know, 40,000 crowns to, if you were to catch and capture any of these people. This fascinating collection of records. But those are available, and those were those crimes against London. So if you were tried, those court records are at the National Archives in Kew in London. So let's talk for just a minute about immigration and immigration records, because you had people who did go back and forth. So immigrants are the people who are leaving the country. Immigrants are the people who are arriving to the country. Sometimes you'll see them used interchangeably inappropriately. But it's important to keep in mind that the British government did not start keeping track of immigrants leaving the UK until 1891. The US does not start keeping an annual log of people coming into the country until 1821. So those people who came, you know, those people who left in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century aren't going to be documented through governmental records, especially in the UK. But you can get lucky enough that you can find some of these records. So if you're looking for people who are Ellis Island, who are pre-Castle Garden, which opens in 1840. You're going to try looking through some of these resources. So immigrantShips.net. University of Aberdeen has a really interesting one of emigration records, mostly to Canada, but there are some other places listed in there as well. Family Search Wiki has a good explanation of the wheres and the hows these records exist. Olive Tree Genealogy has some. She's got a really good site. It's not just Scotland, but she's got a nice collection of Scottish records listed there. And then Scan, which I'm going to talk about in more detail a little bit later on towards the end, is the Scottish Archives Network. They've got some tools for how can I find these records in individual libraries, museums, and archives within Scotland. There used to exist what were called aid societies. So those people, so let me take it a step back. So Scotland started expelling, or I should say the UK, Britain started expelling undesirables, so to speak, for lack of a kinder way to put it. So it were people who were criminals, people who had mental health issues, people who had physical health issues, and poor people were being, kicked out of the country, who were, being sent away a lot of times to Canada and to the colonies and to the Caribbean and to Australia. And these aid societies were set up. You'll see a lot of them, like the heyday of them is really in the 1820s. But you'll find some records before and some records after, where these aid societies were responsible for paying to ship these people out of the country. Sometimes you would have a proprietor in the colonies who would say, send me 50 people, I'm going to pay for their transport, and then they're going to work for me. So basically, a lot of these people were indentured to people within the colonies in order to pay for their transport out of the country to the new world, so to speak. And the Scan, this one's a really good one. Scan.org network, you can find these types of records in there. And some were more notorious for others. You had some proprietors who were terrible human beings who would abandon their people after they arrived, or disasters would strike, a ship would sink, or some other type of tragedy would befall them. And this is a good example of one. So a group of people were leaving the Highlands, mostly McDonald's, who were promised land and work in Canada just to be abandoned once they arrived. And they give that description. It says, besides these 20 souls, there were 32 additional people not on this list who were paying for themselves to go over. But basically the proprietor just dumped them. But it gives you all of that kind of information that comes out of those original records. So it's a really good resource to use to go and find out. If you don't have any other physical proof, if you can't find out, because there's no Ellis Island record, there's no Castle Garden record, these could be a great avenue of research for you. So poke around in those resources and see what you can find. So why are people leaving? What is the reason behind it? There's a couple of good websites out there that kind of explains what was going on. Were they leaving because of the killing time? They were Covenanters and they were fighting for their religion. Was it because they were Jacobites who were fighting for buying Prince Charlie? Is it because they were being kicked out because they were debtors, or because they were those undesirables? Were they leaving because the rents were being raised, like in the 1860s? A lot of people left in the 1860s because rent prices were being doubled and they were being kicked out of their rentals. So John Gray's site gives some really good information about that. Irish Central, again, why did these people leave Scotland, come to Ireland, and then leave? Some really good examples of why and how, and the reasons behind why Scots were emigrating. And you have all of these different things like the clearances, all of these different reasons by time period why people were leaving. So you'll get people, Jacobites, and people who are being kicked out of the country or leaving for their own safety during the clearances. Those are the people who typically wound up in the Carolina area. People who were leaving, who were Covenanters, who were leaving because of religious persecution, were leaving in the 1680s. We're coming to New Jersey, Southern New York, and Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania welcomed in everybody. So there's certain reasons for why people went to certain places at certain times. Military records are split in half. Very few of us are probably going to have a lot of military personnel pre-1707, but pre-1707 records, that unification with James I, James VI, Those records are in Edinburgh. They're at the National Records Office. Those post 1707 records, so now we're a unified country, you know, we're under the crown of Great Britain. Those records are at Kew Garden in London. So there are some local records that you're going to find at the National Records Office. Some things like militias and things like that are going to show up here. But the vast majority of those records are going to be in the National Archives at Kew. So where can we find them? So National Records Scotland has some available through the National Archives website. I give you the link here. It's going to be in your handout. But then there's a lot of sites that are working online to digitize these records as well. Forces War Records is digitizing records. Scotland's People has World War I, Great War Records, wills for Scottish soldiers. A couple more examples I'll show you in just a second. So one of the families that I'm researching, the Kings, they had an ancestor, James King, who had served. He was actually involved in the charge of the Light Brigade. He was at the Battle of Balaclava. I know that he was in the 7th Regiment Fusiliers. I can go into the National Archives, the UK National Archives in London, and I can find references to that regiment and to those records. So Kew has done a great job. This is even pre-pandemic, where I could go in, I can pay £5, like $7.50, and I can get a copy of that service record. But this isn't the only place where it's available. So they contracted, as you can see here, with Find My Past. I could just directly go to Find My Past and save myself the trouble. But you want to look at the National Archives site because you want to see what else is there. I don't want just this single record. I want to see what else might be available on him and his regiment. So Find My Past has some, National Archives has some, but then Forces War Records has some on him as well. So it's not a one-stop shop, unfortunately. So I can see that, again, 1854, Battle of Balaclava, he's in the 7th Regiment of Foot. I can click on Forces and buy that record as well. Same kind of cost, but the National Archives is pointing me to these two different for-profit sites where I can get that information. So they're out there and they're available. So he's a Scottish soldier whose records just happen to be at the British National Archives because that's who was overseeing the Scottish military. So that's where I'm going to go look for these records. Some other places where you can go, if they died during their war service, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, it's British, but it covers everybody. Just like our veterans, the VA burials, same type of thing. Again, Find My Past, like I mentioned. The Gen UKI, which is the United Kingdom, this is a free site. They do have some military records, some vital records, some land records, some census records that are available for free through this particular site. The Imperial War Museum is in London. The National War Museum is in Edinburgh. Look at both, just in case, to see if they have anything on that unit, that regiment, or that soldier or sailor individually. So you have both. Make sure you check both. So let's spend a few minutes to talk about those maps and gazetteers and how we can use these in our research. I kind of showed you an example of one a little early on, but there's lots of places where this information exists. So A Vision of Britain is really a cool site because it's interactive. So you can overlay the modern with the historic and kind of slide back and forth between the two. That's a lot of fun. But if I just want to look at the original records from the 19th century, Internet Archive has them, National Library of Scotland has them. So what I love about the National Library of Scotland is that they wanted to get this in front of as many people as they could. So they put these records in multiple places. So they're on their website, they're in Internet Archives, and they're in other sites as well in the UK. So I don't have to know to go to the National Library. I can still find these records across a number of platforms. Other good maps that are listed there, National Library of the UK. So that's Great Britain's is listed there as well for you to play around with. Those are those records and directories. So in the States, we call them city directories. In Scotland, they're called postal directories. These go all the way back into the 18th century. Before I went to Scotland, I was doing research in Stewarton. So I was looking at postal directories from 1743, 1745, 1750. So these go back a considerable way. Here's an example of one of those. This is a vision from Britain where I can look at the historic image, but then I can overlay the modern image on top of it. and I can kind of slide back and forth between the two. So as I zoom in, I can see the farms, and I can see all of the things surrounding the town. I can see where the railway is. And then I can kind of slide back and forth between the two so that I can see, you know, Michael Street coming off on the right here is meeting into Bridgend and Springwell. That's kind of the modern version, which isn't a whole different from the historic version. So you can kind of see that not much has changed there. And these are a lot of fun to look at. Now I gotta get past it. There we go. Did I skip one? No, okay. So now these additional websites that I want you to take a look at and play with if you haven't done so already. So things like the Scottish Genealogical Society, just like our National Genealogical Society, you know, has resources and guides and tools and tips to help you. You can hire a researcher if you need to. The Gen UKI, which I talked about, it has Scotland, it has Ireland, it has the UK, it has Wales. So these are mostly abstracts and indexes to original images. You're not going to find a lot of digital resources here, but it's a great place to start to kind of get you start to, you know, build your cairn, so to speak, so you can work your research up. If you're like me and you get back into the 16th century and Scottish handwriting all of a sudden becomes, you know, hieroglyphics or cuneiform, there's some really good resources out there. This is one of them, scottishhandwriting.com, where you can kind of test and quiz yourself, where they'll give you a document to print out and they'll ask you to transcribe it, and you can see how close you were. Because the earlier back you go back in Scottish records, the absolutely atrocious the handwriting becomes. So they use shorthand for certain things. So this site helps explain how it evolved over the years, what the shorthand explanations are, and how to read those records. Map in Scotland is just really kind of an overview of Scotland in general, but it's some good information and resources about a general history of Scotland, travel information if you're gonna go to Scotland, modern maps and information available to you. It's a site that I use pretty regularly. But then don't just think about genealogy. We're family historians. So our job is to be able to tell our family in the context of society as a whole. So you definitely want to look at historic resources as well. So the Scottish History Society, you definitely want to be looking at things like, I just drew a blank on the name of it, the buildings, the National Historic House, like the historic places. You definitely want to be looking at sites like that to understand a little bit about, you know, well, if you worked for somebody who, you know, or if you have ancestors who worked on the Lord's land, you know, they were a farmer or they were, you know, a horseshoer or something, you want to look at those properties because there might be some family information available as well. Dictionary of the Scots language. You can't just rely on Outlander to learn a little bit of Scots. You definitely want to be using some of these resources to help you explain, especially when you're looking at legal documents. Some of that terminology even changes throughout Scottish history. So the Dictionary of Scots language is really useful for that. And then drill in. Once you're able to figure out where your family is from, contact those local libraries, historical societies, archives that are within those communities. I'm only giving you kind of a snapshot of some of them. This is by no means all of them, but there's a nice little inventory available through Local History Online, which will kind of allow you to drill in and see what's available for Angus or Argyll or West Lothian. Some of my favorites, my family's Ayrshire, so of course I use the East Ayrshire Family History Center, the Dick Center, the Burns Center in Kilmarnock, but things like Angus Archives, Perthshire and Caithness has a really good family history library as well. All of these are online, both websites, Facebook. A lot of them are on additional resources too, like Flickr and Pinterest. Fifes is a lot of fun. I really enjoy following their Facebook page. Oh, I misspelled it. That was good. Pardon the fact that I misspelled the Hebridean connection. It's been a long morning. Renfrewshire, there's a lot of really good local online history resources available to you. And like I said, all of these people are online too. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a minute. I alluded to a little while ago SCAN, which is the Scottish Archives Network. The National Archives of Scotland has an archives finder on their website. So these are organizational archives. What SCAN has in it are personal archives, which are fascinating to me. So think of all of that history that lives in personal family collections and things like that. They went out and they talked to everybody, whether it was the National Archives, whether it was the National Library, National Museum, universities, family history libraries, public libraries, things like the Mitchell Library, and then went and talked to private collectors. So SCAN works on a stoplight system. So green are archives that are available and open, and you can come in and do research. Yellow are archives that are open, but the collection might be closed, and you'd have to contact them to see if it's available. And red means that they're closed collections and they're not open to the public. So that's where you're going to see the vast majority of these private family collections, but it still tells you they exist, which is something nobody here in the US has ever tackled. So it's an absolute fabulous resource that's available to you to just figure out, does this set of records exist anywhere? And if so, who might have it? Mitchell Library in Glasgow, another fantastic resource. We had a fire in Glasgow several years ago, which I don't know if the library has reopened. The other library has reopened yet, but you've still got the Mitchell Library available to you. You've got the Edinburgh City Archives. They have a really, really good Facebook presence. So follow them on Facebook. They're very entertaining. They post every day. It's always insightful. Take a look, see what you can find for your areas of the country. So that idea of sharing and crowdsourcing, this is what I love social media so much for, is because I might have a photo. I have no idea who it is. I have no idea where it is, but it has a photographer's mark that tells me, that it was taken in Dundee. I'm going to go out to the Dundee Genealogical Society's Facebook page and say, anybody tell me anything about this? Can you identify these people? Do you know anything about the photographer? And they're going to provide information back to you. You're planning a trip and you're going to be going to, the Highlands, and you want to visit the Highland Archive Center. Oh, they're not open on Tuesdays? Well, I'm going to send them a message and say, hey, this is the only day I can come. Is anybody available to be there to help me out? Or, can you provide me any information on where I can go to look for XYZ type records? So don't use it as a one-way street. Don't think that I'm just going to follow them and I'm going to learn history a little at a time. Talk with them, message them, post comments on their Facebook or their Instagram or their TikTok or whatever platform they happen to be on, because it can really be a very rewarding two-way street. So you might be able to answer a question that they put out. Hey, does anybody know this location, or does anybody know anybody from this family? That might be your family and you're going to want to comment on it. So some really fun ones that I use, like I said, pretty frequently. Scottish Indexes, they do a lot of live streaming and they do a lot of webinars and things like that. So start following their Facebook page, because there's always information on there that they're providing that's really useful to us all across the board. Five Family History Center, Edinburgh City Archives, these are some of my favorites, but by no means is this exclusive. You're going to find sites wherever in the country you're researching. But don't just use Facebook. A lot of archives, genealogy centers, libraries have made collections available digitally through other platforms as well, and Flickr is one of those. So not only the National Library of Scotland, which has collections available through Flickr, but there are a lot of other museums, universities, organizations that have collections in Flickr. So I was talking about Scots Irish, and I was talking about Northern Ireland. PRONI, the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, has dozens of collections up in Flickr as well. And it's not always just images. People think, oh, Flickr only has images. No, it doesn't. It has a lot of historic maps, a lot of historic documents, illustrations, drawings. It's not just photos. So if you haven't kind of poked around in Flickr, if you have a Yahoo account, you automatically have a Flickr account. They're owned by the same company. But otherwise, you can sign up. You can even browse Flickr for free without having to sign in. But it's a great way to just go in and see, okay, my family came from this community. What photos are there for Campbelltown? What photos are there for Edinburgh? And see what's out there. some great places, like I said, the Scottish Heritage Foundation, National Trust is who I was trying to think of that I couldn't think of. The Lanarkshire Constabulary photos are really neat too. Library of Scotland, there's lots and lots and lots of them out there. You'd be surprised at the scope and the breadth of these records that are available, and they're not photos, they're all kinds of stuff. So I am going to turn my camera back on. I am going to happily answer any questions that you have. Like I said, I apologize that I ran at like a gazillion miles an hour. But I have to definitely make sure I'm at my own event on time. Otherwise, it might look kind of bad if I don't show up and I'm the one who's supposed to be speaking. But does anybody have any questions about something that I did talk about and you want more information, or a resource I didn't mention that you absolutely adore? Please feel free to share it with the rest of us. We'd all love to hear about it.
Anybody?
I have stunned everybody in the silence. You're still thinking about what I said 35 minutes ago when I was just like,
How can I get your handout that goes with this?
I put a message in the comments, the chat,
I'm gonna
with
try
my
again.
email address. Email me if you did not get my initial blast email, and I will send you a copy of her handout.
Okay, that's great.
I'm going to try to do it again because it was kind of giving me fits. It kept wanting me to try to sign into Dropbox, and that was weird. It shouldn't have had me have to do that. So let me see if I could do it again. So if anybody else has any questions, I'm going to multitask and see if I can do this. Let's see. Because it's only giving me, I can do it through Dropbox or I can do it through Google Drive. So I'm going to see if I could do it through Google Drive. Maybe not. Okay, let's see if this works. I'm going to try it again. This time we're going to try Google Drive. I always joke that the further we get into the 21st century, the more I appreciate the 17th, because I am not a fan of technology. I mean, if it wasn't for indoor plumbing and central heat, I think I'd be perfectly happy to be in the 17th century handwriting letters by firelight. Oh boy. It doesn't like it.
Okay. So while Tina's fidgeting, if nobody else has any questions, like I said, if you did not get a copy of the handout in the blast email, my email address is ems1105@yahoo.com. Shoot me an email and I'll send you her handout.
Yeah,
And
I
I
don't
did-
know. It's being petulant.
Yeah, and again, just, you know, if you can't read the chat, it's ems1105@yahoo.com.
I can try to link it to the recording of the group as well. That will be on YouTube on Monday.
Okay.
Yeah. If
All
you,
right. Thanks.
yeah. If you send it along to me as well, Tina.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Jack, I'll probably need to get your contact info unless Bess included it in my initial message, her initial message to me.
I think she did.
Okay, good.
I'll
Perfect.
talk about it.
Right. Oh, actually, hold on a sec. Bess, you are fantastic. Hold on just a second. So when Bess emailed yesterday, I think she emailed all of us. And if she did that, I could just respond to this message and I should be able to make sure all of you get it.
Woo!
Look at that. All of your emails are in there. Hold on. It's coming your way right now. Let's reply to all. And then hopefully every one of you are going to get it, even those who didn't sign up today. Bye
Okay.
to all.
All right, and question in the chat, just for everybody's information, about Jackie Torrance. We will have a memorial service, but it's going to be when the home is open and we're able to use it again. So I can't predict when exactly that will be.
Okay, all of you should have just gotten a reply email from me with the handout in it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any last questions for me, anyone? Or what's a site that I didn't talk about that you enjoy that we should all be looking at? That was poor grammar, wasn't it? I'm a Chicagoan, can you tell? And my sentence with a preposition. All righty, then I'm gonna run away and thank all of you for having me. And
Thank you
hopefully I'll
very
be able
much,
to see
Tina. It was
some of
really
you
interesting.
in person soon.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks.
Good to see you again, Roger.
Yep, good to see you. I'm in
All right,
Denver.
everybody.
Oh, wow.
All right.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
All
Have a
right.
great day.
All right,
Bye.
thanks so
Bye-bye.
much, Tina. Okay, and does anybody have any other questions or whatever? Otherwise, I'll just remind you to please contact me about volunteering for the games in June on Father's Day weekend, particularly Friday. That would be very helpful. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bev.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.